Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the webinar on material efficiency strategies for a low carbon future, a policy perspective. I'm Reed Lipset. I'm a member of the International Resource Panel and a research scholar and resident fellow in industrial ecology on the faculty of the Yale School of the Environment. I'll serve as moderator as we present and discuss the policy review conducted as part of the recent study by the International Resource Panel called Resource Efficiency and Climate Change, Material Efficiency Strategies for a Low Carbon Future. Thanks to the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, specifically NTNU Sustainability, for hosting this webinar, and to the International Society for Industrial Ecology for co-sponsoring it. We'll start with an introduction to the IRP, which conducted the study on material efficiency. Edgar Hertvich of NTNU will then summarize the results of the sophisticated modeling done to quantify the potential reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that can be achieved through material efficiency. Tamara Malkoff of the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev and I will then summarize the findings of the policy review. After a question and answer period, we'll then invite a distinguished panel of policy experts to reflect on the findings of the study. We'll then open the webinar again for question and answer. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will later be shared to the email of everyone registered and on the NTNU's Sustainability YouTube channel. If you have questions, please type them into the question and answer function in Zoom at any time during the webinar. They'll be answered by a panelist in the Q&A channel or during the two question and answer sessions. As moderator, I'll work hard to keep us on schedule so that we can get to all the interesting content. I'll use this chime as what I hope is an inoffensive reminder to speakers to let them know when their time is up. Now I'm pleased to turn our virtual podium over to Maria Jose Batista, who will provide an introduction to the IRP, putting this recent research in context. MJ?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening for some. Indeed, I'm going to present just a couple of slides to explain a little bit, introduce you to what we do at the International Resource Panel. Next slide, please. So we are a science-based platform, and we basically were created within the United Nations Environment Program with this idea of delivering a science policy interface specifically on the sustainable use of natural resources and their environmental impacts over the full life cycle. So similar to what IPCC does with climate change or IPBES with biodiversity laws, we have a group of experts from all over the world who, based on some guidance from the users, the policymakers, carry out research specifically on natural resources. Next slide, please. And the panel's main mission is really to provide independent, and that's important, coherent and authoritative assessments that are policy relevant, that can be actually applied, that include solutions as well on the sustainable use of natural resources and their environmental impacts over the full life cycle. And we aim to contribute to a better understanding of the concept of decoupling. So how to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation while enhancing human well-being. Next slide, please. And the panel, as I was saying, proposes policy solutions, actually. So we identify problems, but we also try to propose solutions by problems related to resource depletion or misuse. And there are different dimensions, and you will see some of those dimensions in the report that will be soon presented by some of the experts of the panel. So you can think about pricing and fiscal measures. You can think about the rebound effects, efficiency measures, substitutes, alternatives. That's the kind of thinking that goes into the IRP reports. Next slide, please. The setup is basically it works with three main groups. We have the scientists, people like Reed or Edgar or Martin are members of this panel. We in total have 36 scientists, and they are the ones in charge of producing the reports. The countries do not get into the actual research. They provide guidance on the potential questions that could be useful to respond. They have to be policy relevant questions, but then after that, the panel really prepares and carry out the research. We have the secretariat hosted by UNEP, and I work for them actually. And then we have the steering committee, which is a group of 27 governments, the European Commission and UNEP, that helps steer the group, identify potential policy relevant questions, but also bring the knowledge of the panel to political fora for further action. And this is our science policy interface. We work with a lot of strategic partners from different regions, from academic institutions to more political institutions like the OECD or UN as captive commissions of the UN all over the world, the economic commissions. There are many examples, but we use these platforms not only to disseminate, but also to bring our knowledge into action. Next, please. Next, thank you. And finally, just to mention that we have over 30 published reports since 2011, actually. And since the inception of the panel, we have been covering topics like metals, land use, forests, cities, decoupling. And at the beginning, the IRP focused on resource clusters, you may call them, so water, land, and soils, metals, etc. But now the IRP is looking more and more into the interlinkages of those clusters and always looking at these through the resource use and environmental impacts lens. For instance, of the case of food systems or cities are two of the most recent examples. Back in 2017, the IRP published a report that was requested by the G7 to the group called Resource Efficiency, Potential and Economic Implications, that explained a little bit why resource efficiency can help also achieve economic growth and job creation, and it can contribute to climate change strategies. On the basis of that report, we were asked again by the G7 as a follow-up to really zoom into these climate change contributions from resource efficiency. And the response to the request is the Resource Efficiency and Climate Change report that Edgar and Reed will be presenting. Thank you.
Thanks, MJ. Next, Edgar Hertvich will summarize what has been learned through the modeling of the impact of material efficiency strategies on greenhouse gas emissions. Edgar is professor and international chair at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU. He served as lead author on the material efficiency study. Edgar?
It is my pleasure to introduce to you the quantification of potential greenhouse gas reductions from materials efficiency. But first, a few words for why we are looking at materials in the first place. As you might imagine, the production of materials causes greenhouse gas emissions. Just the magnitude of these emissions hasn't been very well understood. A recent quantification shows that in 1995, about 5 billion tons of CO2 equivalents were emitted in the production of materials. And by 2015, this had increased to 11.5 billion tons, now constituting 23% of global total emissions. The most important materials in terms of their greenhouse gases are iron and steel and other metals, and cement and other construction minerals. Next slide, please. Of course, the production processes of these materials are hard to decarbonize, and we expect about a 20-year time horizon until technologies will be commercial and introduced to the market for decarbonizing steel production and cement production in particular. So the options to reduce greenhouse gas emissions really are on the use side. We would like to use less materials and less emission intensive materials. And here are the specific strategies that we have investigated. So the most obvious seems to be to just use fewer materials in order to produce the same products by designing products lighter, or to use less emissions intensive materials, and so that through material substitution. Further, we can improve production process so less material goes to waste in the production process itself. Another strategy is to use products more intensively, thereby requiring fewer products to provide the same amount of services, or to use products longer by lifetime extension, again, slowing the amount of renewal that is required. At the end of the life of product, we also have options. We can recover parts and remanufacture them or reuse them as spare parts, for example. And then finally, we can reuse the material through the recycling. So those are the different strategies that we have looked at. And we have looked at buildings and cars and the application of those strategies to those two product groups. Next. So first, why have we used those two product groups? It is because about 40% of the materials in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions are used in construction. Another 40% are used in manufacturing, and vehicles are the most important product from the manufacturing sector. Next, those products require large amounts of materials, provide essential services, and show a significant potential to reduce emissions. Next. Now looking at the houses, the homes in the G7, we can see in 2016, most of the bulk of the emissions was associated actually with operational energy use, and this is what people know about houses, but still the substantial portion, about a fifth of emissions, was associated with the materials that were used for constructing and refurbishing homes. Now, our modeling assumes that we have a transition of the energy system towards an increasingly renewable and low carbon energy system, and an increase in energy efficiency consistent with the 2-degree scenario. And under such a scenario, the emissions associated with homes in the G7 would decrease by about 50%, as you see. And if we, on top of that, apply these material efficiency strategies, next, emissions would be reduced by another 35%, and about half of the emission reductions would come from the material cycle, whereas the other half would come from reduced energy consumption. Next, in China and India, which we also investigated, the situation is somewhat different. There is fewer requirements of heating and a much higher rate of new construction of buildings, which means that building materials are more important and operational energy use is less important. And the decarbonization would also be effective here, and increased energy efficiency by 2050. Next. And if we apply material efficiency strategies, emissions could be brought down by quite a lot, as you can see, because of the importance of savings associated with materials. Next, in the G7 now, if we look at what are the important strategies, more intensive use is really the most important strategy by far. And so that is something we need to remember for the policy debate. Next. Now moving to passenger vehicles in the G7 countries, you can see that operational energy use and associated emissions are really dominant. And by a shift towards electric vehicles and the cleaner electricity mix would contribute to decarbonizing that sector, however, not sufficiently. Next. If we apply these material efficiency strategies on top of the introduction of electric vehicles, we can see that this would achieve a further reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and the emissions associated to materials would become quite small. Next, in China and India, we expect a substantial increase in the consumption of transportation or the driving distances. and an associated increase in the car stock, and that would increase emissions even though electric vehicles would be introduced also there. Next, and applying these greenhouse gas, these different material efficiency strategies would again result in about a 35% savings of emissions. In all these cases, there is quite a substantial saving of emissions. Next. And what are the most important strategies for cars? Well, it is ride sharing, just having fewer cars on the roads and doing the trips by sharing rides. There is car sharing, which we model. So if people share cars after each other, and then finally, we also look at smaller trip appropriate vehicles. And that is often connected to car sharing, that in fact, when people share cars or use shared fleets, that they tend to use smaller vehicles on average. Next. And with that, I would like to wrap up the information about the modeling. So the scale of the emission reductions would be significant within the emission reductions that need to be achieved, assuming a 1.5 or 2 degree emission scenario. These emission reductions would not depend on fundamental technical progress as a decarbonization of materials production itself would be. And with that, I would like to hand it back to Reid Lifset.
Thanks, Edgar. Okay, I will present an overview of the findings and insights from the policy review now. My colleague Tamar will follow with a focus on the strategies and policies for material efficiency, specifically through increased intensity of use. So the goal of the review was, not surprisingly, to identify policy opportunities and needs by identifying existing and proposed policies, especially by reviewing assessments of material efficiency policies, and then looking to see how what we learned about the policies aligned with what we learned from the modeling. So there are 3 dimensions to this analysis. In the center of this figure, you can see the product life cycle, because policies can apply anywhere in the life cycle. Around the outside of that circle, you can see the 7 material efficiency strategies. Those too can be applied to any of the product life cycle stages. And then specifically for policy, there is a causal logic that is really important, that we need to know that a policy exists. We need to know about the adoption or uptake of the material efficiency that the policy is encouraging or requiring. Then in turn, we need to know about the outcomes in terms of material use from those material efficiency strategies. And finally, the last step is that we want to know what actually happens to greenhouse gas emissions as a result of the change in material efficiency policies. The potential scope of the relevant policies is daunting. We've got cars and homes, 7 material strategies, at least 4 life cycle stages. That's 56 combinations and maybe more. So lots of potential places where policy may be relevant. The result of the review is not actually a systematic review, as the term is used in academia, but a primer, an extensive compendium of research that gives an orientation about existing policies and potentially important gaps. The aim is to give a solid overview for guidance to policymakers rather than applying a strict methodology, because while there are studies of greenhouse gas impacts of some material efficiency strategies, there are very few studies that encompass policy, strategies, and outcomes in terms of both material use and greenhouse gas emissions. Summarizing the policy findings is a challenge because much of the value provided by this review is in the compilation of disparate research into an organized overview. The richness lies in the details. Today we'll have to make do with perhaps what you might call a lightning overview. So what did we look at? Academic research, research from governments and gray literature, that is studies by consulting firms, NGOs, industry, trade groups, and so on. We found that most of the studies focused on end of life, and in particular, the attention was to the quantity of materials diverted from landfill disposal. We found studies of greenhouse gas emissions arising from material efficiency activity. Some were empirical, some were modeled, but we didn't find very much in the way of the study of impacts of policy on material efficiency activity or on the resulting changes in greenhouse gas emissions. We particularly didn't find much in the way of evaluations of policies after they were in place. We did find that evaluation couched in terms of policy uptake, what organizations or jurisdictions adopted a policy, with some monitoring of the outcomes, but little analysis that differentiated between outcomes resulting from the policy versus outcomes resulting from changes in society or the economy. Okay, let's start by looking at residential buildings. Design is cross-cutting. It influences multiple strategies, material choice, construction technology, building use, end of life, but it's not typically subject to regulation per se. But when material standards and building codes are adopted by governments, they become de facto policy. Most of the standards and codes that we found were related to, that is, most of the environmental standards and codes were related to energy efficiency because of the Zoom toolbox. All right. I'm not sure what's causing this. We also found that codes can serve as barriers to, oh, I see. Hold on, please, while I fix this. Sorry.
Hello, Ray. I think
Yeah.
you can, if you go into more and the three dots, there was an option that allows you to hide the hide floating meeting controls.
Thank you. All right.
There you go.
Back to where we were. So, where was I? Thanks. I went back a step. Excuse me. So, talking about design and building codes. Codes can stand as barriers to material efficiency. For example, standards for concrete specify at least a minimum amount of cement, and this makes it hard to reduce material use in the context of lessening material use. We did find that building energy efficiency is one of the unusual places where there is ex post policy review. So there are also opportunities to pursue upstream material efficiency strategies, such as using less material by design or reducing the generation of waste on construction sites through the use of building information modeling or prefabrication and modular construction. BIM is modeling a building project in a three-dimensional environment through collaboration in the supply chain with architects, engineers, contractors, and suppliers. Prefabrication is the production of building components offsite in a factory environment and their assembly at the building site. Interestingly, these technologies are one of the places where there are overt policy mandates. For example, the UK, Denmark, and the state of Wisconsin in the US mandate the use of BIM or prefabrication in some public buildings. Singapore is especially advanced in policy mandating prefabrication as a way to address labor shortages. There are some studies of environmental impacts of the use of BIM and prefabrication, but no significant policy evaluations were found. Okay, let's shift to cars here. Lightweighting, that is using less material by design. We found almost no policies that specifically addressed the size or weight of cars, but we did find that as a result of fuel economy policies, in some countries there was a reduction in the size or weight of cars. In terms of product life extension, repair policies were not aimed at environmental outcomes, but rather at consumer protection. Remanufacture is not very common with passenger vehicles. It is much more common for large trucks for their engines and their tires. There's a great deal of policy around end-of-life vehicles. It's primarily focused on landfill diversion with much less attention to greenhouse gas impacts. It's particularly focused on the recovery of the non-metal components of cars because the metal components are readily recycled. The non-metal components are not. There are also a variety of policies and challenges that apply across economic sectors and life cycle stages. We can't address them all here, so let me just talk about one. For the others, please take a look at the report. So green public procurement, that is the use by government of its purchasing power to achieve policy goals. This is widely used for a variety of policies, including environmental purposes, but much less so for material efficiency strategies. It's hard to measure the outcomes of GPP, as it's called, because first you need to have policies, of course, that are part of GPP that address material efficiency, and those in turn must change material use, which has to be measured, and then those must change the emissions. In fact, environmental evaluation of GPP environmental strategies is not common, especially life cycle assessment is quite uncommon. However, life cycle design and assessment are really important if we're going to avoid burden shifting across different stages of the product life cycle, and thus to make sure that there is a net reduction of greenhouse gases across the whole product life cycle. One interesting example of where this is done is in the Netherlands for infrastructure projects. There's software called DuboCalc that is used in the procurement process. It's a lifecycle-based software tool that quantifies a range of environmental impacts of construction materials. Based on the materials used, an environmental cost indicator value is calculated, a single value for all the environmental effects, based on the cost of preventing emissions. That value is added to the conventional costs in supplier bids as part of the tendering process in procurement. So it's actually a real world example of using a life cycle approach. Let me finish up here and say, as noted, policies for material efficiency don't exist for some upstream strategies because those upstream strategies are not widely recognized. And in fact, most material efficiency policies focus on end of life. There is a need for much more in the way of sophisticated policy evaluation, and especially to incorporate a life cycle perspective to make sure that the result is a net improvement in greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, we don't see a good alignment between what was found in the modeling about the potentially most effective strategies and where policy attention lies. Let me now turn this over to Tamara Markov, who will talk about policies related to the material efficiency strategy of increased intensity of use of cars and homes. Please go ahead, Tamara.
Hi, Reid, thanks. So basically, as you heard from Dr. Hartwich, the policy indicated that enhancing utilization is one of the most effective ways that we can have both a win-win in terms of material efficiency and climate change. So now I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes just going over policies that are specific to this aspect in housing and cars. Next slide, please. So to begin with cars, next. In cars, we have two basic strategies. One is that there are many single passenger trips, and what we want to do is basically get more people into those seats. So have cars not driving with only one passenger, but have it 2, 3, 4, and more. The second direction is to reduce idle stock. So just to give some context, the average passenger vehicle is parked 90% of the time. If we can reduce that to, let's say, 20% of the time, we could use that material more efficiently. Next, please. So I'm going to start with single passenger trips, okay? This is a potential solution commonly discussed, is how do we reduce empty seats, for example, through ride sharing. So we have these carpooling ideas that have been around for a very long time. So this could be the traditional, I'm going to take a friend with me when I drive to work and we'll pool together. Or we have digital option nowadays that we can connect with people via different platforms and apps to fill those empty seats. Next slide, please. So in terms of policies that are specifically targeting increasing the use intensity of cars, ride sharing has a long history as well. So for carpooling, for example, we have high occupancy vehicle lanes that are pretty common, both in the US, you can also find them across Europe. And we also have reduced tolling. So if you are driving a couple of people together in the same car, maybe you'll get a lower price for the toll bridge or something like that, or to enter cities. Now, because passengers share rides, it's critical that we understand the impact here in terms of policy. So what is this doing on ownership of vehicles, right? So those aspects are less well studied, the impact on ownership per se, but we do know that getting people together also saves the fuel and other materials that are needed during the use phase, and hence we also have a material benefit here, and of course, greenhouse gas. So next one, please. So now let's jump to go into idle stocks. Great. So the idea with idle stocks, a potential solution is we want to reduce car ownership via shared vehicle fleets. So this won't be I'm taking another person with me in my car, but would be something more akin to we are both using the same vehicle, but at different times, right? So we can combine, drive together, but also use the same vehicle itself. So in terms of stocks, we can think about things that have been recently dubbed the sharing economy, which are shared vehicle fleets. And the idea here is that people would get access to vehicles and forgo ownership. Now, ultimately, this is expected to reduce the overall fleet size, but there's still some question about that in terms of research, and we still need a bit more evidence on that. In terms of policies that try to encourage car sharing, they're somewhat newer and less common, and they're mostly aimed at increasing used mobility. But these could be things like preferential parking, right? Where the city allocates parking spaces to, let's say, Zipcar or Car2Go or one of these platforms or other shared mobility forms. That would be this type of policy that can encourage shared mobility. And again, reduced toll pricing as well. But these are not specific policies that are geared to increase material efficiency. Mostly the ultimate goals are different, right? It would be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So research on impacts of car sharing is limited, and the relationship between the specific policies and ownership per se, like I mentioned previously, requires more research. It's a little understudied. Next slide, please. So if we're discussing buildings, that's another big issue. Next slide, please. So we're talking about ultimately one approach, which is we want to get less space per person, right? So reduce the number of square meters that each person uses for living. So this translates into less space per person, and thus less materials for construction, but also less materials and energy during use. So the solutions that are commonly discussed are mostly share and multi-purpose spaces and also smaller dwellings. So on shared and multi-purpose spaces, we have things that we're all familiar with. It's roommates living together, sharing a kitchen, sharing a bathroom, right? Sharing the same apartment. But we also have common areas in high-rise buildings, for example, where the entire building shares a laundry room, shares a pool, shares a gym, shares the lobby, the elevator, right? Now, more recently, we've had new platforms, new approaches that came in with digital peer-to-peer lodging. So the big example for this would be, for example, Airbnb. Now, the idea here is pretty similar to the one that we discussed for cars, which is reducing idle stock. But this is a much more complicated idea. It's not specific only to lodging, it's also tourism, and there are many discussions about what types of rebound effects happen. So I'm going to put a pin in that and leave that aside. You can read more about it in the report. And another idea that's been around for quite a while, and given the local pandemic and the fact that I am at work now, but sitting in my home office, is of course telework. And I'm sure we'll have a lot more research and more insights and more interest in this option and this type of solution coming up. Read. Next slide, please. So in terms of policies, most of the policies that we surveyed and found that were relevant were not material efficiency specific, and mostly dealt with peer-to-peer lodging and curbing peer-to-peer lodging. So again, these would be policies to regulate peer-to-peer lodging, and you can read a bit more about that in the report. And in terms of policy impact on material efficiencies, this is really something that we think there's a gap there, and it's vastly understudied. So another solution, next slide, please. Another solution would be simply reducing the size of household dwellings. So this is more straightforward, right? Less square meter per person. So it might not surprise you that we didn't find a lot of policies that seek to reduce the area per person from a material perspective, right? So in fact, some countries, there are policies that are actually counterproductive for this measure, and they actually seek a minimum of space per person. So this was more the historical focus, which we might want to shift a little bit nowadays. So next slide, please. In addition, reducing house sizes will meet different types of barriers that include zoning is an impediment. For example, there are many countries where the zoning only permits houses from a certain size and up, or from a certain number of room and up. Taxation in many cases also runs counter to this idea that we need to tailor the size of the dwelling to the needs of the families. Because, for example, if you're living in a house and switching homes has tax implications for you, you might choose to remain in the same household, even though the kids have now grown and you really don't need such a big house for just you or you and your spouse. And also, people view housing and large houses as a form of financial security. So this might be another barrier, in a sense, where people want to hold on to those dwellings and not necessarily downsize because they view it as their savings, right? So just in sum, next slide, please. So just to summarize, the modeling suggests that increasing the use intensity is one of the most effective approaches, but there are only a very few policies that are aimed at enhancing intensity of material efficiency in terms of increasing use intensity during use phase. And in fact, policies could actually point in the different or opposite direction, and we need to be mindful of that. And finally, the impacts of the policies are vastly understudied. And with this, I'll return it to Reid to summarize.
Okay, thank you very much, Tamar. I'd like to open this up for some questions. Actually, one question was asked, can the model be easily adjusted to add more countries? I think a lot of countries would like to do similar country-specific analyses. Edgar, could you respond to that?
Yeah, that's fine. I think that the model can be fairly easily adjusted to different countries, but it requires country-specific information on the characteristics of the stock and the population and so on. So yes.
Okay. Another question was that I noted that there are limited evaluations of policies after they're in place. And the question was, is this type of analysis especially difficult or expensive? It is difficult. You need the right kind of data. One cannot do the kinds of controlled experiments that happen, for example, in the medical world and other hard sciences. But what social scientists do in this respect are what are called natural experiments. They look where there are particular kinds of changes before and after, or you might say side by side with different locations that allow one to draw inferences about those changes. But one does need the data and the particular circumstance to allow that. One of the questions we're going to entertain in a few minutes in the panel discussions is how to move forward on policy evaluation. So I hope more can be said about that. Another question is how to balance material efficiency strategies with safety issues that often require more material. It's true that in some cases more material is needed, but there are many cases in which that's not the case, that what one might call the extra material is a function of outdated standards or other requirements for features and utilities that people want that aren't related to safety. Are there other questions? No. All right, let's turn to the panel. So we have three panelists: Rodriguez Tornquist, who is a member of the steering committee of the IRP and Secretary for Climate Change, Sustainable Development and Innovation at the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Argentina. Professor Martin Heyer, who's a member of the IRP panel and a distinguished professor of urban futures, and Tiffany Voss, who's an energy and industry researcher at the IEA. I'd like to start this I would like to start this panel by asking the members, what did you find especially interesting or surprising in the policy chapter of this report? So, Rodrigo, could you start?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to, do you see me? Fine? Okay. Thanks to the IRP and the International Society for Industrial Ecology for inviting me to participate in such a prestigious panel to discuss the results from the policy review of the IRP report. I found it very interesting. I think it's very needed. And my main comment, my preliminary comment, would be the same as Tamar. I think that we really have a challenge in transforming these findings of the report into policies, into specific policies. As the report proposes in several chapters that a large share of the possible improvements to be made in efficiency towards a less carbon-intensive system are in increasing the density of use in vehicles and occupation in buildings. And this could be more extensively considered as a question to be answered in policy formulation. Apart from my hat as Secretary of Climate Change, I'm also a professor of urban planning and transport planning. And I really think that we need to better understand the sectoral evolution, both from the urban planning and the mobility sector. In terms of mobility, I think that we should consider to transform these findings into policy actions. What we call in the transport sector the three revolutions: the change of the paradigm of one car per person to the electric, shared, and autonomous mobility systems. There are many assessments made by the OECD that estimates the GHG emission reductions of these potential scenarios that I think that could be linked to this report. That brings to my mind a quote from Jaime Lerner, the famous mayor of Curitiba in Brazil, that says that owning a car in the 21st century will be like smoking a cigarette. Is not going to be something that will be well considered socially. Almost every car manufacturing is thinking about how to transform their business model from selling cars to selling miles. And I think that we have an opportunity there. In terms of the construction, I understand that we need to rethink also how the urban planning evolution is moving forward. We are all identified that urban sprawl is a key issue to be addressed, and we need, as the report mentioned, more dense, compact, and connected cities. Also, on the other hand, the pandemic invited to rethink cities, but also to rethink our lifestyles. Many people is moving to the countryside. In Argentina, in the 10 last months, we've had a great amount of people moving 100, 200, 300 kilometers from the city, and like promoting the work from home office and coming to the city once a week just to have a couple meetings. That invites us also to think not only about the residential buildings, but the office buildings. We are now at this moment, I'm at the downtown of Buenos Aires, and I could bet that 70% of the offices are empty and no one is using them. Actually, my office is absolutely empty. I am almost the only one in the building. And my question is, are we going to come back all together, all the team at the same time? Well, that is something that we could think about in order to make resource efficiency policies. Also, just to conclude, I think that we are in disruptive times, and we need to think about disruptive changes. So we need crazy idea. The question is, how can we ensure the integration of resource efficiency approach into the sectoral policies? Definitely, we need to consider and further understand the policy approach in every assessment and make the most of this opportunity that the pandemic brings us to rethink our lifestyles. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Martin, do you have some thoughts about what was especially interesting or surprising? I seem to have lost Martin.
Thank you.
There.
Well, first of all, I thought it was extremely timely, both the report and also the fact that we are now having this conversation, because sort of if we think about where we are, I mean, it's no longer a need for people to get the awareness that we have a problem, and we're rapidly moving into implementation. Even targets have been set. And then, of course, we as a panel have to be much more active on policy instrumentation. How do you do it? How do you get into that transition, or what Rodrigo just called evolution, right? So the dynamic perspective really requires attention. So say the modeling is sort of about the possibility space, which this report marks out really excellently. And then what I would call futuring is marking out a space of aspirations. And so that is, I think, the crucial debate for us, because I think you're quite right to do what we have always highlighted, the rebound effect, right? So if we look back at environmental politics and material efficiency strategies, we eat up everything we gain. I mean, in the report you say smaller vehicles. Well, what do you see? We see SUVs, right? We've even calculated how much steel that accounts for. It's totally bizarre. And like Rodrigo said, if you look at cities, you say smaller homes, what do we see? A trend of de-densification. So, I mean, what sort of policy instruments do we talk about? We talk about societal transformation. And if we want to get out of that corner where we constantly say you're not allowed to have the car you want, you're not allowed to have the suburban home you want, we have to go into thinking about how do we tap into aspirations? How do we tap into post-fossil lifestyles? And so I think that if you look at the elements of the report that you mentioned, you can actually connect to that quite well. But then I would say there are two things we need to add. So thinking in terms of concepts like neighborhoods, or thinking in terms of the 15-minute city, which is very trendy in Europe at the moment, avoiding people to need to move around, having everything at walking distance. I mean, these are game changers. But then the question is, why would that be an aspirational lifestyle, right? How does it work? And I think that dynamics requires us in a debate on policy instrumentation to start to think of what I would say is sort of an overlay of social science ideas about what we in the literature now call desirable futures, like the article of Bay and others recently. So, and then I think we should also connect back what Tamar mentioned, as separate, the sectoral, talking about mobility and talking about dwellings. These things belong together. And in the Weight of Cities report, we calculated that if we add up all these measures, we had a factor 10 reduction of material needs. And if you also look into the street pattern, the way you organize a city, that is the sort of reductions in material needs that you can get to. But and connecting to the issue of COVID, of course, which is a great way of thinking of possible alternative futures. I mean, the worst thing we could move into is, of course, that people say, well, we need a home with an extra study, more square meters. No, what we have to think about is, can we have, say, collective spaces where we go to if we want to work without being disrupted by children or people knocking on the door, like in my house at the moment. So, so that is rethinking the high street, which probably is necessary because shopping is partly going online. So urban planning approaches I would really promote in terms of policy instrumentation. And finally, there's one thing that I find particularly interesting and I'm keen on sort of exploring further. You, of course, also say we need to move out of concrete and steel. Now, wood is, I find very interesting, not only as a material, and you can say there you need policies like that the avoided CO2 emissions can also be paid for, which is not the case in many policy environments. But wood is something that seems to be that aspirational good. So when it was in the earlier days, wood was the poor man's material. Now it seems to be it's the rich man's material. So if you can have a villa in wood, that's cool. Or if you're in a business and you have a high-rise building with wood, that's a cool building. Now, that logic that connects our material efficiency needs to aspirations, I think, is the sort of the discussion we need to also take into account more in order to avoid the rebound effect as the big game spoiler.
That's great. Thank you. Tiffany, your thoughts on what was interesting or surprising in the report?
Well, thanks, Reid. And first off, thanks to the organizers for inviting me to join the panel, and also just a big congrats to the authors. That I found the report really insightful and comprehensive on what is, of course, a really important topic for achieving our climate goals. So for me, in reflecting on what I found really interesting about this chapter, there were kind of two key themes that stood out to me. So the first being complexity and the second being opportunity. So complexity in terms of really the diverse amount of policy solutions that we'll be needing. So as Reid mentioned, there's at least 56 different subcategories that we're going to be needing to look at when we think of the variety of different strategies, the different life cycle stages, the different materials, the different actors involved, and all the different kind of barriers that we need to overcome. And so to really tap the full material efficiency potential, we'll need quite a wide range of policies, ranging from mandates to incentives to training programs and other types of strategies. So here it seems that we'll need all different levels of government. So there's maybe some policies that we can have coming from the federal government level or a national government level. But in terms of these types of policies, we'll probably also need local governments involved. So working on things like zoning regulations, building codes, parking requirements, and this type of thing. So it's not something that can necessarily just come top down. We'll really need a complex range of actors involved. Also, I see complexity in terms of what needs to be done to get the policies right. So when we're talking about material efficiency, there's a lot of trade-offs that can be involved. So we don't necessarily just want to have a policy that says, use the minimum amount of material in a building to start off with, because we need to consider what implications that might have in terms of durability in the long term and this type of thing. So here, of course, life cycle assessment is really important to get those trade-offs right and make sure that we aren't having any sort of perverse outcomes. So really to get the policy design right, we're going to need critical thinking, robust research, and looking at ways to make policies flexible so that we really can achieve the ultimate goal that we want, which is reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to me, out of that complexity of the number of different policies and how difficult it might be to get them right, I see a great opportunity. So in the chapter, it was mentioned multiple times that there isn't a lot of policies yet in this space, perhaps with the exception of end of life and recycling policies. And so this contrasts to other areas like energy efficiency, where we already do have a lot of policies. And so this then is an opportunity for government, for the research community to contribute to something really important. And I would just say that along the lines of this report, the International Energy Agency's research has also found that material efficiency is a very important strategy for getting our energy system towards net zero emissions. And so in our sustainable development scenario, we find that material efficiency is actually the second most important strategy to get industry emissions to be reduced. So we see it accounting for about 30% of emission reductions in the heavy industry sectors relative to our baseline scenario. So that really is a key strategy that has a big impact. So great opportunity there. And in addition to sort of this opportunity to contribute, I see that it will be a lot of work, and that in and of itself seems to be, to me, an opportunity, particularly at a time when governments are looking to stimulate the economy and to stimulate jobs. There could be a lot of job creation in this area, both in terms of designing policy, in terms of evaluating compliance, so lots of work in the area of life cycle assessment and this type of thing. And then, of course, on the ground work in actually implementing these policies for the designers, the construction workers, the people looking at setting up end-of-life recycling systems. So maybe if there's a way we can make linkages between material efficiency and the benefit of job creation, that could be something that we could use to help promote this type of strategy. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Well, that's great. Thanks. Let's see. Let me ask Rodrigo if he has any thoughts about how climate policy could actually incorporate some of the material efficiency strategies.
Thank you so much, Reid. In the capacity of coordinator of the National Cabinet on Climate Change, we are working nowadays on the design of the national plan on climate change, on adaptation and mitigation. And we need evidence of the impacts in terms of GHG emission reduction from these resource efficiency policies. And we lack of that evidence. As you may know, once we are in times of implementation of the Paris Agreement, we are in times of action. We need to propose specific measures to be discussed with different stakeholders and build consensus on how to move forward for the implementation. As you understand, every measure related to climate change and resource efficiency has winners and losers. And we need to be very clear to promote these measures, showing that they reduce emissions, but they also can promote increase of competitiveness, and it will not affect works and some productive sectors. So 10 years ago, we were thinking about theoretical pathways for decarbonization. Now it is a political and a social discussion, and we need these technical inputs in order to nurture this discussion and have more evidence on how to move forward. That would be my first reaction to your question. Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, let me turn to Martin and go back to this question of policy evaluation. That's tough to do, both methodologically and for real world reasons. How can we learn more about the effectiveness of the policies that we're actually using?
Yeah, I think that the old sort of textbook on policy evaluation needs to be rewritten in light of the urgency of the sustainability crisis. It just cannot afford that long cycle. So the alternative that we entertain is experimentation. And the idea being that we need a systemic approach to experimentation that is a learning environment for civil servants, people in the cities, and academics alike, where everything that has been tried out is understood for its successes and failures. So it's much more a learning environment than a sort of traditional policy cycle where you would adopt a plan based on academic research and then implement and then evaluate. So it's the cycle of reflection and feedback needs to be much more direct. And so in the case of the Netherlands, we now have our first steps in climate change, getting rid of natural gas, which is the main source of heating our homes. And we stumble into all sorts of problems, but there is a nationwide learning environment where all these experiments are evaluated and shared. And so that is, I think, what we also require when it comes to material efficiency. And having said that, it's obvious that if, say, for instance, in our case at the European level, we have strong targets, that's the start, right? We need tough targets, but that's just the start. Beyond that, immediately you must have such a learning environment, including the possibility for failure.
So, as an American, I'm wondering if we can convince the public and government officials to say, we're just trying this out and you're guinea pigs in a country where we can't agree that global warming is occurring. But that's just my American cynicism. Let me turn to a question from our audience. We were asked, takes a little bit of explanation. Different nations have different cultural characteristics that determine how advanced technology or sustainable policy that we think we need to transform our society will be deployed or adopted by a culture. So the question is, how much and to what extent do the panelists think we can incorporate cultural differences in our analyses and interpretations? For example, what if ride sharing is not a solution that would work for a culture, or are we just relying on the market economy's invisible hand to compensate for such differences? So maybe we'll start by asking Edgar to make a comment on that, and then Maybe we'll turn it to Tiffany because she's also, I think, a modeler.
Well, I think this is not only a modeling question, it of course relates to the assumptions that we make in the modeling. I mean, in the modeling, we don't assume a specific model of ride sharing, right? So I think ride sharing happens in all societies. It's just most common that you share the ride within the family and not outside the family, right? And it's more that sharing with strangers is uncommon, and that is what is now enabled with these app-based solutions. That's the new thing. We can share rides with complete strangers. When there's a social, the app has a social network sort of built in, and we can rate each other as trustworthy passengers or drivers and things like that. But there has always been ride sharing, and I don't believe there is any culture where people don't share a car. It's just happens to be mostly within the family or extended family. And so I think that there are solutions like that. And I absolutely think that cultural aspects are quite important, you know, whether it is the design of the buildings or the preferences for transportation. And so that is something that we somehow need to take into account. And yeah, it's a good question.
Thanks. Tiffany, you have some thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah, I would say I largely agree with the sentiment that Edgar has, that, of course, it's important to take culture into consideration with these types of strategies and policies. When we look at a modeling perspective, of course, we have different regions in our models. So our models at the IEA, we have about 40 different regions that take into account these different characteristics. But you know, when you're doing a global modeling study, we might not get the on the ground kind of differences for every individual locality or every small country. And so that's where it comes down to, of course, at the sort of actual on the ground policy making and implementation stage. Hopefully the people there are familiar with the culture and what is appropriate, and can adopt or kind of adapt the policies to that local context. So of course it's important. And I guess the hope would be that even if one strategy isn't perfect for one locality, that they can adopt a slightly different strategy that can still ultimately come to the same objective of reducing material use and ultimately reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks. So another question from our audience. How can policies support critical thinking and disruptive ideas, whereas in most countries of the world, administrations and financing agencies, according to good governance standards, usually ask local actors to comply with strict pre-planned frameworks, support conventional regulatory standards, do reporting of their finance with clear budget lines? Doesn't, by definition, a disruptive organization have an unconventional way of working? Maybe I'll ask Martin and Rodrigo to to take that one on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the question is to the point, in the sense that some of these procedural standards that we have are straitjackets and that need to be taken on, starting also with the curricula at universities, teaching people different ways to assess what quality is and what to take into account. Sometimes you also see this in a multi-level context, so that frameworks that are imposed from a higher level governments are fought by local governments, for instance. So there is a lot of tension in between, even in the hierarchy of governments. And if we are always afraid of these conflicts, then we're not going to get anywhere. So we need to have a culture of appreciation where people, you know, with reason say why they want to get out of that straitjacket. So to go again to in the Netherlands, for instance, we have now quite a movement among builders, architects, housing corporations that are infuriated by the fact that building in wood is so complicated because of regulations that just did not anticipate building in wood. But then it is about how you deal with these regulatory frameworks and also show your intent to do something about it. But obviously, you can't immediately change them. So it's also about communication and appreciation of the limited knowledge that every one of us has about how to get out of this terrible sustainability crisis we're in.
Rodrigo, some thoughts on this challenge?
Well, a lot. I'm not sure that I can be very clear on my response, but by definition, situational planning means identifying an objective, identifying ways to get that objective, and moving forward. And then think again about the diagnosis. Since everything changed in the last year, we are facing the impacts of climate change that we were thinking to face in 10, 20, 30 years nowadays, Texas, or Central America, or whatever, or fires in my country. We've lost 1,100,000 hectares in the last 8 months of fire. Okay, the biggest drought in 60 years. And on the other hand, the pandemic showed us that a little organism like this, a virus, can knock us down. So we all need to reflect and rethink again the way we plan and we do policies, on an everyday basis. Following Darwin, the species that cannot adapt will not survive. And we are not much more than a species that is thriving to survive. So definitely we need to adapt to the new times and need disruptive solutions for disruptive times.
So thank you. I wonder if any of the panelists or speakers would like to ask a question of one another before we wrap up.
Well, a comment? Any innovative and disruptive idea for designing resource efficiency policies related to GHG emissions reductions is very welcome, since we need to put our hands to work on designing the pathway to accomplish the commitment of the new NDC we presented this year. So every idea is welcome to all the panelists. Thank you.
Martin?
I think the is really timely, and but I think it shows the need to get to sort of an integrated approach. So if you see these potentials in these different sectoral domains, I mean, but we have to go beyond that and think about how you can connect them to each other, and that, I suppose, is where the next type of collective work could lie.
We have a comment from one member of our audience saying that appreciating Martin's point about aspirations needing to change, but wondered, actually fits very well with your comment, Martin, about the need for coordination in some of the policies. That ride sharing is hard even in a household because of activities housed far from where we live and not on transportation routes, that people have to manage the risk in terms of investing in houses. How we all see the need for integration. That's a tough task. I mean, it's, here we are narrowly focusing on one specific strategy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, changing material use. We're not talking about decarbonization of technology. We're not talking about energy efficiency. And even this is, the complexity is quite striking. How do we begin to do integration?
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
No, so I briefly touched on that whole discussion we're now having on a new understanding of our future cities. So Ana Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, with her 15-minute city, Charles Marino is the intellectual owner of that concept, basically won an election arguing that she wants to have a sort of rethink Paris to avoid people having to travel, to commute so far and so often as they have been doing over the last decades. Barcelona is redesigning its entire Cerda city center, the super blocks in the center, almost entirely pushing out cars and bringing back in greenery, bringing back in work. London is rethinking its high streets. So, you know, the London high streets are completely car dominated. They are rethinking that as public space. Toronto is thinking about densifying the suburbs, so that I mean, people not from the suburbs have to go to the central business district, but can actually find work in the suburbs. So that shows that urban planning has that capacity to connect these things that seemingly are separate, and hopefully also tap into aspirations that people say, well, you know, I actually like it. I mean, perhaps I don't have a big garden, but now I have times on my hand. I have something new, quality, namely time in a day, quality time with my family and friends.
All right, I think we planned this. Well, any other comments from panelists or speakers? Then I would like to thank everyone for their participation. Tiffany, Martin, Rodrigo, Tamar, and Edgar, and Maria Jose for their presentations, and thank everyone who tuned in. The recording will be available to those that registered, and I urge you to take a look at the study and to contact any and all of us. Thank you very much. Have a good